if you look at what the Roman Catholic Church has done as an organisation throughout its existence, and it has done some very bad things indeed, and yet people still want to belong to the Roman Catholic Church and call themselves Christians. That makes no sense.
Today's guest is Jon F White, one of the world's leading academics on myths, Norse mythology, and Indo-European history. From the Vikings to the Vedas, from Zeus to human sacrifices and spirituality, he researches topics that lay the groundwork for the world we all live in today, including the effect that organized religion has had on your everyday life. Were Jesus, Mohammed, and Buddha even real people? We go over the evidence today, and a lot of it will shock you, so enjoy the podcast.
Of Will John.
So, guys, we have another special guest. This is going to be something. I would like to classify this podcast as story time because you normally say, "What? Go grab a cup of tea." Is that what you said?
Right. Exactly. Good cup of tea.
It's very nice and British, nice and relaxing. Go get a cup of tea. Which we have another podcast called Biscuits and Tea.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. You and a few of the guys, isn't it? We'll chat.
Yeah. So. Guys, we're going to get into a whole lot of stuff that I know plenty of people know I'm interested in. But finally we have somebody who's incredibly knowledgeable. So I won't be talking out of my ass, and he can tell us what's going on. So Jon, why don't you give a little quick intro into who you are?
How do you do, William? I am Jon F White. I run a YouTube channel called 𝗪𝗪𝗡, and there I take an academic look at mythology. And that means I try and let people understand where myths come from, where the motifs come from, what they mean, and their origins. And what people find fascinating about this is we can trace many myths back, not hundreds of years or thousands of years, but some tens of thousands of years. And what that means is that we really all are from the same seed. We're all the same people, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and so I binged quite a bit, and so you have a specialty though. What would be your specialty?
I'm educated in Anglo-Saxon and Nordic mythology.
Okay.
So Northwest Europe is my real specialist subject. Europe, I'm pretty good at. Mm-hmm. Indo-European.
Sure.
I consider myself pretty knowledgeable.
Okay. Then we'll get to your specialty here in a sec. So I know you're gonna have some good comfort. Let's take you out of your comfort zone slightly and head into the Vedas. There's a whole lot we're going to go through, guys. So definitely, I just want to start here. Could you explain what the Vedas are? And then I just have a little bit of a question, just an understanding to we'll go from there, basically.
Okay. So you're talking about the Rig Vedas. They are associated with a culture in India, the Vedic culture primarily. They are considered our oldest religious texts. So they're probably about 3,500 to 4,000 years old, the texts themselves, but they probably go back another 1,000 years or so, the premise of them. And there's masses of them, and they're in like poetic form. And what we find about these texts is that many of the older stories we know are poetry, because it's a lot easier to remember poetry than it is to remember prose. And so there are many stories talking from how the world was created, how dragons were slain, and generally how to behave in life.
So what do you take then? This is something that we should probably also get into. I mean, the fact that you're studying mythology, where do we draw the line between factual mythology? We've got, I mean, how do we, is there any truth? Are they pulling from truth in certain things that they say? And, in the Vedas, like for instance, what do you take from things called like the Siddhis? What do you take from stuff and them purporting to do things? How do we,
Yeah, that's a good question. So mythology is based on truth. It's not a story. So mythology was used to explain how people thought things were, but didn't necessarily understand how they really were. So they make up a story about it, but that story they considered real. And there's a real difference between myth and story. So stories tend to be sort of often pictorialized or iconographized by our ancestors, where myths tended just to be told. And so you actually find, certainly if you go back to Paleolithic times, mythology is very rarely represented, but stories are. And so we know a lot of stories, but we don't necessarily understand why mythology is what it is, which is why there's a lot of academic research into trying to uncover that. So myth, yes, is based on reality, so normally based on something that has happened, but the reasoning they use for that thing happening is often made up.
Okay. In our modern age, we like to feel that we have a better grasp on reality and the nature of things than they did. Do you feel that that's true?
Yeah, given a real example, a different example is they felt the rains and monsoons came because in India, their storm god Indra killed a dragon which was withholding water in the sky. So when you heard thunder and lightning, that's Indra fighting the dragon, and when he kills the dragon, then the water's released and there's rain. And that's what rains. You kill a dragon. And that is common throughout the world. That's a really common motif.
Okay. So killing a dragon is causing rain is a common myth amongst.
It's part of the core religion of Mesopotamia.
Mm-hmm.
We see it in basically the early European farmers. We call them Neolithic farmers. When they wanted rain for the crops, they blamed that on water. That eventually that dragon came part of the creation myths, many creation myths. Social water in China, it's the dragons that created rain, and Australia, South Africa, it was the dragon that put water on the soil to make the earth grow and become fertile for people to live. So dragons have often been associated with water. That only changed about 7,000 years ago when we started farming cows, and then things changed. And that's a very interesting motif we could look at.
Okay. So things changed when we started farming cows. Does that have anything to do with is that related to the Hindu religion and their reverence of the cow?
So yes, the cow. So when you're farming crops, obviously crops are important to you. In fact, they're very important to you because once you stop farming meat, you get weak and you have to eat more food. So agricultural farming was a really bad move for the health of humans. So which is why we're really puzzled why we started to do it. But as soon as you start farming meat like cows, then you're actually eating a lot better, and cows become really valuable. And so if cows are the most valuable thing, then you build your stories around cows. And so what the people we call Proto-Indo-Europeans, or people who spoke a language called Proto-Indo-European, started to create a religion based on the cow. And the cow was important, and that myth travelled through Persia into India. And there the cow was sacrificed in creation to create animals and vegetables, and so was considered sacred, which is why you can't kill cows in Hinduism. But in Europe, Europe was very much an agricultural farming base, and so the cow wasn't used in the same way. But you still see it in myth, like old Norse mythology. There's a cow called 𝗲𝗪𝗪 in the creation myth with Ymir, and Ymir suckles on 𝗲𝗪𝗪 to get his strength.
So, with all that though, is it not, or should we find it weird? I mean, you just said that the myth spread, right? But is it not weird that separate cultures in different places and times had similar myths? Is there nothing weird about that? Or
that's a brilliant question, because that's what everybody tends to challenge from when I say, so Ymir suckling 𝗲𝗪𝗪 the cow to get milk in their creation myth is the same as Romulus and Remus suckling the wolf to get milk in their creation myth. And we see a slightly different view in Persia where the cow sacrificed, and India. But it's all come from the same people. And like you just said, will people then say, well, how do you know that's the myth that has dispersed and not people coming up with the idea? And that is because the people in the myth with the cow at the start of creation, whose names originally were Manu and Yimo, which means man and his twin, that name are consistent in all those stories. So if someone just thought of the story of a cow's important, they wouldn't have come up with the same names of the people with the cow. Not in Norway and in India. But you have Manu in India and you have Manu in Norway.
Wow. Can we let's talk a little bit about the oldest creation myth? I saw a video and something that you went on, because I know that's gonna also bridge things in with plenty of religions pull their power from this. We got this. We know how it started.
Yes. Well, they really don't. So most creation myths we know today stem from the Indo-European myth, because the Indo-Europeans spread over, say, to India and Europe, and those people then went on to colonize a lot of the world and spread their influence. But before then, there was a myth, and that very first myth we can trace back into Africa, and there was a motif called people coming from the underworld through a tree. So originally people thought that people came into the world climbing from underground and out of a tree. And that eventually turned into a myth where an animal or a person was on water and there was no land and dived down to the bottom of the water, like the bottom of the sea, touched the bottom of the sea and brought that mud up to the surface. And when it hit the surface, land grew. And then that changed to, from going to the bottom of the sea, grabbing land and coming up and the land grows, to stories you hear about Noah, for example, and his doves. So when Noah releases a dove and it flies off and grabs branches and comes back, that is actually a evolution of that earth diver myth. He's just changed the direction of it. Dove travels horizontally rather than vertically. But all this tends to probably stem back from a very early myth where it's thought that man may have well thought he excreted land out of himself. Because it had to be born somehow, the earth, and men wanted the world to be shaped in their image rather than women's image, and not wanted to be sexist here, but most mythology up until recently was written by men, for men, about men. Adam created Eve from his body. Your God created Eve from Adam's body. It was always man that done it. And so, there are things you get Freud, although he's got this recognition nowadays saying things, this is sort of pregnancy envy by men, wanting to give birth to something. But yes, if you're a primitive man and you excrete, then you've created something almost from nothing. And they just had that process, and that is how land created, and that developed into, say, the tree myth and then the earth diver myth.
Sure.
And then we see these myths, the earth diver and the dove myth, as I call it, and then that goes on to an animal in a tree dropping fruit, and where fruit lands, that turns into land. Just spread to many myths around the world.
Wow.
So that's the very first sort of creation motif. We haven't actually got the whole myth, like the whole story, but we know that part of it. That's how they think land was created.
And you touched on the flood myth, which the origin of the flood myth is one of those things that you kind of learn about later on that has its ties to things like Epic of Gilgamesh and maybe other things before that. So what are the true origins of the flood myth, and does that negate the story of Noah in any sense? That's the way modern Christians feel.
Yeah, so one of the things about mythology, I'll say, is that when you study it and you start seeing the myths develop over time, you start really realizing that all stories, religious or not, are man-made. And that if you start realizing that, then you have to look at the world in a very different way anyway. But yes, the flood myth itself looks like it stemmed from Southeast Asia. So China and the islands around there. And that probably happened maybe 30,000 years ago or so, we believe. You can trace it back to there. And we think that coincides with sea level rises and lowering because of the ice age. So when Earth goes through an ice age, all the ice builds up by taking seawater out of the sea and into ice. And with seawater out of the sea levels drop significantly. And there, where you have islands, those islands start linking up and you have a large landmass. And you could literally walk from Scotland to about 20 miles away from the Australian mainland without having to cross sea. And so there's only a little gap there to travel. So we believe that when the sea levels sort of rose again after an ice age, and all that land in Southeast Asia turned back into Indonesia and the Philippines and created those islands, that probably was the seed to start talking about floods. And then we see, say, the motifs used there, and they use the earth diver motif from the creation myth. They actually repurposed that into the flood myth, and it was that went back into the Near East and became Noah's flood with the dove.
What then do you give? And I've heard this theory and with a bit of an understanding I didn't hear so far back as 30,000 years, but when I've seen this, they talk about 10,000 years ago, or roughly something like this, right? That something happened.
Oh yes, the Younger Dryas period is what you're thinking of.
Okay, the Younger Dryas period. Is that not where I feel like people link up that experience right there with, okay. Okay,
And
that's
they
what
do
I
that
thought.
'cause
So
the
you're saying it goes
Indo-European
deeper.
Yeah, that's about 12,000 years ago, where there was a sudden dramatic climate shift across much of the Earth, not all of it. So it wasn't an ice age, but there was sort of mini ice ages on certain parts of the world. So we're a bit confused on why that was. But yeah, so and that raised and lowered sea level significantly. But there was before then, 20,000 years ago, something called the glacial maximum, and that's when the last ice age peaked. And that was when glaciers were all the way down to southern England and across middle of Europe. And so that pushed all the populations together who were in northern Europe down south, and that caused a lot of change and cultural shifts. And we see that in population changes and migrations. And it's when that finished about 18,000 years ago, sea levels started to rise again. And everything was normal before the Younger Dryas event when the sea levels lowered again. But because that was the most recent one, people think, oh, it must be that. But actually, we can trace through. So how we do this is we can look at the languages spoken and the stories spoken by various cultures around the world and understand how and when they migrated and use that to work it out. So, for example, if we see myths told in North America by First Nation Americans, we can often, providing they're not Christianly influenced, so like through colonization has influenced the stories. So if we know they're earlier than that for the language spoken, we can tell that they must have come across when there was a land bridge between Siberia and North American continent. And so that means that's got to be at least 14,000 years ago. But then, but because you can see different tribes have different genetic makeups, you can actually tell, well, was that part of the first migration in the glacial maximum, which was 20,000 years ago, or a later period, maybe 15,000 years ago? And that's how we can start using that. So we map the language, the type of story, the motifs used with genetic information and understanding how migrations worked to build up a statistical model whether it is probable that that motif spread. So, if you want me to be honest, everything I say today, there is always an element of doubt. But what I am saying is what is the most probable outcome based on the academic work we've done to date.
I appreciate that with the fact that, yes, there is, an element of doubt. But what confuses me is I went to school and school told me things were like this. And so let me see if I can formulate my question in the proper way. Based on what you know and based on all the things that, let's say, that the academic world and what you understand of the traveling of the stories, languages, and understanding of the glaciers and the ice ages, isn't it likely that we are missing possible civilizations underwater, completely smashed, gone? Like, are we missing something? Like, given that there's a little bit of doubt, is that possible? That's what I want to understand, because I know that that's a big thing out there that people feel as if, and I won't say the buzzword Atlantis, but I can definitely ask you about that, because actually that's really, I didn't even write that down, but I got to know what you think about that. But in general, it would make sense though that I don't know to the level of the development of the civilizations, but I mean, if there's these large land masses and these people settling, are we missing something?
What people don't tend to understand, they don't necessarily conceptualize when they think about history is actually how long time is and how slowly things happen, but how much change that happens over a long time. So things just don't suddenly change. People don't suddenly just migrate over a night time. Things take years to happen. So sea level rises will happen over the course of 1,000 years, let's say. Okay, so without doubt, there were large cultural groupings which are now underwater, like their buildings or their homes underwater. But only in a few instances would I say that sea level rise caused the wiping out of a civilization. It wouldn't have. They would have seen the sea level come up for 6 inches a year for 20 years. They're not going to go, oh my, I'm just going to stay on the beach and let it drown me. No, they'd moved on. People, the pyramids, for example, is a good one.
Right.
So people think, pyramids, modern technology, must be aliens or whatever, or some people think that. But for about 5,000 or 6,000 years before the pyramids built, we were spending that time building irrigation and farms and minings or working stone to build sort of, let's say, the irrigation channels and the buildings and all these things. And when you've got that much experience, stone, making pyramids isn't as big a jump as you think. Because you know how to work stone. So, because you've been building mile-long channels in the desert for
right.
last year. People just don't get that there's a large number of causes for something to happen, and that can happen over hundreds or thousands of years before we suddenly see something different happen.
Right.
Yeah.
The progression. So there's a progression that would happen, and that makes sense, obviously, with the sea levels rising and dropping, that it doesn't happen overnight. I thought that the theory on the Younger Dryas was that it was a cataclysmic event, that it was either something happened and poof, boom, you guys are gone.
Probably happened over maybe a few years, couple of years. And there may have been tsunamis and things like that. And there certainly were. So we know that Britain, United Kingdom, used to be attached to Europe through a landmass called Doggerland. And we know that was pre-Younger Dryas. That was definitely there.
How long ago?
The Younger Dryas event, the rise of sea levels after Younger Dryas, removed some of it, but then there was a tsunami in Norway, a landslide under the sea, which then produced a tsunami which pretty much wiped out Doggerland. So there was a cataclysmic event. But we didn't have cities then. I mean, we were just still in little huts and things. We didn't lose the wondrous secret to life, and all the aliens that were there who were living in Atlantis, weren't caught unawares. It's something's happened.
Tell me about Atlantis then. Tell me more about this, because from what I understand, that the story, I would love to know if this is true too. The only source that we have for Atlantis comes from Plato. Is that true?
Well, he's the original source, yes. And from then you get embellishments.
Okay, he's the original source. He's clearly taken it from someone else, though?
I can't tell whether he's taken someone else or he's made it up himself. But I think he says 9,000 years previous, there was this land. And tell me, how does a lineage of people remember the actual timeline in years exactly for 9,000 years to tell him it was 9,000 years ago, to allow people like Graham Hancock? He says, he uses that as, it must be Atlantis because it ties in with the Younger Dryas period. But there's no way a lineage of people could count 9,000 years. Between 1,000 BC.
Okay. I have no idea how that would even be possible. I want to push back just to get your answer, because I have no idea. What about if you could do it through, what did the Egyptian kings have? The kings list, right? Which I know to a certain point is considered.
Oh, no. Well, some kings live hundreds of years in that list, which...
That's exactly it. So how does that work, though? Isn't it accurate to some point, though? Can't we actually use it?
It's a guide. It's a guide in terms of the sequence of kings may be accurate, but maybe the years associated with them may not be as accurate.
Okay, cool.
I mean, but what most people don't realise is not many people really bothered about their age. Even 1,000 years ago, they worried when it was summer. They was worried about when it was winter, but they didn't really worry about what age they were. They just worried that they could grow up and fight in a war.
That's a good point.
Get married.
Okay, the biggest hole, obviously, in the Atlantis idea, and where it's spurred on to a whole lot. Okay, from all that is that Plato is the original source, and when did things start getting aliens / city under the water? Everything that happened. Did it happen fairly after Plato?
I can tell you a piece of mythology that's happened in the last 100 years that has done exactly the same thing. Okay? So a man was walking through, I think it was Nevada or Arizona, and he found a piece of nuclear, it was a nuclear testing balloon. So they floated in the sky to analyse atomic bombs going off, and a bit of it had crashed. And he took it home. And 50 years later, we have Roswell and aliens exist, and that was a flying saucer, and we've got live aliens. And that's in an age where we have newspapers and radio and television and a better education system. And yet there are people who believe that a bit of foil and stick has turned into something more. And that's how humans are. We like to embellish. But that's a real myth. That is modern mythology.
Sure. If the same thing becomes a myth. I don't know enough about the Roswell. I should actually probably have someone. I don't know who I would have on.
Well, what made it worse is because the US Air Force is there with its secret base and secret missions, it just adds to the air of mystery. No one knew what this thing was because it's quite unusual back in the day.
Okay. You mentioned something. This is now in your world. Before we actually go back to something else, I can't pronounce it properly. I want to say Yggdrasil, the Yggdrasil secret.
Yggdrasil.
Yggdrasil. Okay, can you tell me what this was? I didn't get the chance to watch this.
Okay, so the Yggdrasil is what is known as the world tree in the mythology written in Old Norse texts. So that's the Nordic mythology, Scandinavian sort of myth, and it is a tree which has a number of different purposes. And what makes it interesting, so it's meant to sort of connect all the realms of the Nordic world together. So Midgard, which is Earth, in effect, with Asgard, which is where some of the gods live, and to hell. But the thing about it is that there's a poem and called the 𝗪𝗛𝗡. And the 𝗪𝗪𝗡 is a really interesting poem. It's over 1,000 years old. And it is basically like a list of proverbs, I say so, and it tells you how you should live your life. And it's really interesting because it applies pretty much as today as it would 1,000 years ago. Yeah, be hospitable, invite people in. If you get two men in a bar drunk, they will fight. And there's some other more politically incorrect stuff, but it is pretty true to life. Anyway, there's a part towards the end of that which talks about Odin, and Odin is the chief god of the pantheon, and Odin hanging himself from the Yggdrasil. And people, it's quite ambiguous, and people have all been working out for a long time. I mean, there's been masses written about this. So what actually does that mean? What is it? Odin hanging himself? Is it someone hanging himself for Odin? And so what does the Yggdrasil really mean? And Yggdrasil sort of means Odin's horse, literally. But in the video I put out, I'm actually saying what's happened there is poetic simplification. So an example of poetic simplification is Frankenstein. So if you say to anyone who's Frankenstein, they'll say, oh, it's the monster from Mary Shelley. But that isn't. Frankenstein was the person who made the monster. But over time, people sort of simplify and say, oh, Frankenstein's the monster. Well, that's what's happened. It looks like it's happened to Yggdrasil, where it was called Odin's Yggdrasil. So it wouldn't be the horse of Odin's horse of Odin. So that doesn't make sense. It must mean something else. And so that's what the video is about. It explains what I think the origin of the Yggdrasil is, which is more to do with a tree of knowledge or a tree of life, which would really actually link it to motifs in other beliefs throughout Europe and Persia and into India. So that's really what that is. That what we often see now in mythology, in the names, and we associate with things today, back then were very different. People had a different view of life and a different way of looking at things, and people have to accept that through time not only does language change, but the meanings of the words we say change. And that's another reason why mythology is complicated.
I mean, very complicated. I mean, it seems an almost endless game with tools that are, you're limited with your tools. I mean, you need a time machine. You need to go talk to people who aren't here. You need to go visit places that don't exist.
Exactly. But that's why we use statistical probability to say what we think is the best answer. But you'll always get people who argue, well,
right,
something less probable could well be the answer. And you've got to say, well, yeah, it could be. But prove to me, your evidence is stronger than mine.
Sure. Can you tell me more about, this has always been an interesting thing that I never dug into, but you always see it. I mean, you see it in video games, you see it in movie things, the Berserkers and I believe wolf warriors.
So there is truth there. So there's a professor called Bruce Lincoln who wrote a brilliant article on this. He's called the 𝗪𝗟. And the 𝗪𝗟 is the Greek word to describe it, which means rabid. Okay, when you're in a sense of 𝗪𝗟, you're rabid, but it's a special kind of rabidness. So it's a rabidness that is applied to horses or other animals, but not wolves. And he concludes it's not applied to wolves because wolves are naturally like that. They don't need to be ill to be like that. So, but that is that state of mind, that way of being when you're a particular person that makes you almost invincible. And then that is applied to various cultures. So we see the Berserker, which means bear skin in the Scandinavia, where people would wear a bear skin and get in this rage and sort of be very formidable. but you see it in the Greek, that's mentioned. You've seen it in Persia. You see it in a number and you see it in Rome as well, where people wear lion suits or wolf suits. So it was a real thing, really happened. But where the considerations must be is, how did they get into that state? And that's a very interesting thing. One that, I say, it's a rabid state. They say it's like, imagine an angry wolf state or a rabid animal. It's literally, that's what it means to be.
Sorry to cut in, but like the idea essentially that they are these warriors that they're not going to feel any pain. They're going to come through hacking and just through nothing scares them, nothing, whatever. And so there is a little bit of truth to the fact that there were some people running around like that in some sort of state like that. We don't know how they got into that state. We don't know if it's drugs or psychedelics or.
Reality is that there was probably some drink associated with it that put you in that state. And we could talk about that, because that drink's called, it appears in many mythologies across the Indo-European landscape. But if you look at it in literature and mythology, you only find it's the heroes that came that way. So it's almost like you had to be an heroic warrior to be able to get that lysa, to get that rabidness. It wouldn't be applied to anyone. They could try, but they wouldn't always get it. And it's things like this. So it's when you read mythology and you see this appear. So we see it, for example, a lesser known one in the Tyne, which is an Irish myth about herding bulls across Ireland. The main character there is 𝗪𝗛𝗡, and the Ku means wolf. And you actually see people describe him as a sort of a formidable hero, and you start realizing, so if he's got that must be influenced from the Indo-European motifs. So it's very much an Indo-European motif thing, that particular thing. So but basically it's picking up those and saying, if you see it in myth, then you can actually see, now I know where the influences come from, and what the premise was behind it, that this was a heroic warrior who must succeed in whatever he's doing.
What was the drink?
So in Vedic, so the Rig Veda they talk about soma.
S-O-M-A?
That's soma, M-A, yes. And that drink was used. You have it in Greek, his name escapes me in Greek, but you also have something called the mead of poetry in Scandinavia, and it all does the same thing. So you drink it and it puts you in this hallucinated state, or almost certainly does. And there's a book called, there's a couple ones. One called The Sacred Mushroom. The other one is The Immortality Keys, probably the most famous one. And that talks about it. And the author of that writes that this looks like it's come from something called barley beer in the Near East. And so his view is that in the early days of agricultural farming, so about 10 to 12,000 years ago, if you picked up a handful of barley grains and put it in water, the dirt on your hands would help ferment the water and the barley grains. And the barley grains themselves, there's a very common fungus. And that fungus, we now know today, is a key chemical in which we use in psychedelics. So his premise is that perhaps it was that taking that barley grains, putting it in water, let it ferment, and it isn't beer as we know it today. But if you drank that would put you in that way. And then if you think about that, so before then we were hunter-gatherers eating nice bits of meat, the odd deer or elk, and maybe the odd piece of fruit, but we stopped all that and decided to grow crops, which took a lot more effort. You got a lot less nutrition from it. You have to eat a lot more to get the same nutritional value. And so we actually see humans become physically smaller and weaker when they become farmers. Why did they do that? And one of the arguments in the Immortality Key is that we did it because actually we found by doing that we had a good supply of this barley beer that put us in a very good state. And it's pretty much that is when human civilizations really started to evolve at that point. So you could then also argue that actually having that happen to us put us in a mindset to expand and populate in a way that we would never have done
Sure.
otherwise.
I mean, yeah, it's fascinating. That's that part. I had a question down, and you've kind of just touched on it, but I was going to ask what the relationship to all of the myths and kind of the creation stories, and as well as just us as humans, that you believe psychedelics and hallucinogens actually played. I mean, this is one thing that's debated quite a bit, but what do you think based on what you know?
I think they were in there somewhere, definitely. How common it was, I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't think it was an everyday thing for everybody, and I think it was probably ended up being quite controlled by religious groups and organisations, because there's this the increase of esoteric type knowledge started coming along, certainly in Egypt and in Greece you see it, and Rome, and that's possibly where we start seeing that. And we do have fragments of what we call Orphic hymns in Greece, where they sort of hint at how this is made. And again, it's barley and mint and water. And I say, and it's this barley with this fungus. I think it's called ergo something. But it is a key chemical component of psychedelic. So you can't have that in India as well, and in Norway, and it not be a thing. And the thing about this soma as well, so we see that warriors. The story is the warrior sacrifices this soma to the warrior god, normally a storm god, and the storm god gives the warrior strength. So in effect, it's very similar to the sort of wolfish rage dislicer myth. So you have this drink, you get this rage, and then you can go off and kill your dragon.
Wow,
that is very much it. So it all seems to be linked, like an adaptation.
And that reminds me of a question. Valhalla is that's within your realm right there. But I don't know actually the true understanding of Valhalla, what it is exactly. But the question that I have on it has more to do with considerably quoted part about people either, what is it? They're plunging to their death, jumping off is that mixed with Valhalla and that understanding, or is that a different? It's definitely a Norse. Like for instance, it's one of these. You must have seen some of these comedies, Norsemen, for instance.
I haven't. I watched the telly.
No, I watched it in Danish. So it was a lot of fun. But they have this part there where there's a supposed either myth or understanding from the ancient peoples that when you sacrifice yourself, you had to like throw yourself off the cliff. You don't know about this?
Okay, so yeah, they're sort of taking it to an extreme. So
okay,
in reality, so it's quite a complex subject. In reality, when you're born in this Nordic world, your fates are known when you're born. So there are some Norns who carve your fate into the roots of the Yggdrasil tree. So they're all over the realm, so they know wherever you are. And those fates tell you when you're going to, or say you are going to die at this time. That is fated. And because you're fated, your death is fated, as a person, it doesn't matter what you'll do, because you're never going to die until your fated moment. Okay? So that means that there's no point staying at home and missing the battle, because if you're due to die, you're going to die at home. You might as well go into battle and not die. So that was the premise of it. And then Valhalla, which is a more recent addition to this belief, the Nordic belief. So because before I think it was just known as just the hall of death, rather than a place where people go when they die. But to go to Valhalla, you have to die in battle. You have to die an honourable death, and then only half the people who die an honourable death get to go to Valhalla. And they go to Valhalla such that when the end of the world comes, which is called Ragnarok, which is a Nordic myth, and Odin controls Valhalla, Odin can then use you in his army to help make sure Ragnarok doesn't end the world. And that's the whole point. So what happens is that Odin actually gets some of the best warriors killed, so he has them in his army when Ragnarok happens.
Okay. Taking a hard turn left. I'm not even going to preface this at all. Is Jesus real?
I mean, was he an historical figure?
Was Jesus a real person who lived on earth like you and I are here right now? That's the question.
If I had to put money on it, I'd say no.
Okay. And why?
But, I mean, so it's mythicism, as I guess they call it. But I mean, there is. It just seems odd. I mean, there's some great scholars who have some good arguments to say, actually, there's enough evidence to suggest that he almost certainly was some kind of person. But I think he's really, at the end of the day, a manifestation of a number of different stories and different people wrapped up in one. I mean, you can't be like that and have literally zero evidence of him until 30 years after his death was when the first gospel was written. And perhaps that there are stories of Jesus before Jesus was born.
What? Wait, say that again? Say that again? How is this?
There are stories about a Messiah from God being written before Jesus was born.
Okay, related to the one who became the Christian Messiah.
Well, yes, same name. Yep, the same name was used, and he had only done certain things that were then recounted in the New Testament as in different stories. But we see
where were they coming from?
So some of these are from Gospels that weren't published, or texts that weren't published. I'm not
like the Gnosis, the apocryphal text, or the ones that
the apocryphals, because they were a bit later. But there's some earlier writings. I know from about 50 BC that start talking about the Messiah and Jesus and things like that, and coming. And it's I say, to me, there may well have been a few people that did things that may have influenced some of the stories, but I don't think there was a single person that all those stories truly reflected.
Sure. Is it true that there is no proper historical evidence or probably for him outside of these gospels? We don't have a tomb. I know there was the hoax just a few years ago with that bone little box
no
thing.
Tangible evidence. No, it's
none.
No. So the first written evidence we have of him that we can say is about him is the gospel, I believe. And then after that, there's independent. What you really want are independent sources, and they didn't start appearing till 100 years later. After he was born. So and they probably only started to appear because stories were being told by Christians anyway. So you hear about Pliny seeing Christians having a bit of an uprising or causing a disturbance. I think that might have been in Anatolia, so Turkey. And he writes to the emperor, says, "What do I do?" And the emperor says, "Oh, don't worry about them. They're nobody to worry about." But then I think he then talks to Tacitus, and Tacitus starts writing something. So you start seeing him popping up, but only because people within the same sort of administrative branch of the Roman Empire are talking to each other rather than this. But Christianity, is a very interesting topic, especially the organisations that then appeared from it. I mean, we could talk for a week about those.
I'm curious a little bit though. I mean, definitely if you can go into some of it, because I mean it relates to so many of people now, because most people will not. I mean, I don't know anyone who's done a deep dive into everything that you're doing, but most people, it stays fringe, right? It stays superficial. Most people's religious beliefs aren't actually. Most people can't pay attention anymore anyway, right? We're just sitting there TikTok and doing. We can't pay attention to anything.
TikTok, Jesus.
Yeah. We're in trouble but other than that. You can talk to a whole lot of people in Western society, and they'll tell you, oh yeah, I'm Christian or I'm Catholic or I'm whatever. It means nothing. It just means
you belong to a group of people. And I've had this discussion. I've said, look, if you look at what the Roman Catholic Church has done as an organisation throughout its existence, and it has done some very bad things indeed, and yet people still want to belong to the Roman Catholic Church and call themselves Christians. That makes no sense. Do you get other Christians saying, "Oh, don't," like Halloween is a good example. There are some more extreme Christians say, "Don't believe in Halloween, don't believe in ghosts and demons and all that." But then when you go to church, they say, "Bless the Holy Ghost." So on one hand, they want you to believe in the Holy Ghost. On the other hand, don't believe in ghosts. So what? And you see these contradictions all the time. There's some of the best stories I hear, like in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church approved, I think it was 6 different heads of Mary, Jesus' mum, were on display in Europe at the same time.
As like the actual head?
The actual head. So also either the Virgin Mary had 6 heads, or there's obviously something else going on there. But there's all sorts of things. So the Pope isn't actually the Pope. He hasn't got that title. There is a Pope, but he belongs to an African sect of the Christian organisation. There's all sorts of things that we just don't.
I mean, I heard about there's some other pope. What's the Black Pope? Or there's another thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just found out about that.
But it isolates it. I mean, we've got, if you see what the original New Testament looked like before the additions and changes.
Talking about what is that? Not the Council of Trent, but when they started
long before that. So yeah, there's something
before that.
Before that, you actually see, like, the Gospel of Mark doesn't have Jesus resurrecting.
Okay, well, he dies in
like chapter 14.
Does he die and is this over?
Girls turn up to or women turn up to the tomb and then run away scared and don't tell anyone he's gone from the tomb. But there's none of him appearing in Nazareth or wherever. That doesn't happen. That's added later. We can actually prove that was added later. And then gospel. So you got all these, and that's why they sort of, I mean, I say, you see it in all through mythology, in every other religion, you just see these myths develop and change. And what I certainly know is that we build God and religions in our own, what we want our own image then, to make them like. Sometimes we want them in our own image, but sometimes you just want them to be what we want. And you see that very clearly in mythology. They're nothing more than our own imagination.
As a matter of fact, I think we had a pastor on our other podcast, and I asked him the exact same question, which of course he would cite it. No, he's clearly real. Yes. Yeah. He's clearly a real person, and we didn't have enough time to kind of push to say, why? Because that's the more interesting question: is why do you believe that? But I don't even know how you're going to answer this question too, because this is another video that I didn't see. But you have a video out there on what to make of the story that Jesus killed and cursed people.
Yes, the Gospel of St. Thomas. So that is a bit tongue-in-cheek. So I'm normally very polite and unbiased about religions, and people respect me for that. But occasionally I do have a little bit of flippancy at Christianity because it's so big and popular, and there is so much. They're just hypocrites in many, many ways, and the contradictions are galore. And so we know this is a Middle Age story. It's early Middle Ages. Someone wrote some child gospels about Jesus as a child. And today they read like a comedy where quite an R18 sort of comedy where Jesus as a little child comes along, gets upset with his mates and kills them because they upset him, and then makes adults blind because they tell him off or they can't talk. And it's just like, wow, it's just like, and they've decided not to put that in the Bible for some reason. I can't quite work out why. But it's obvious it is written long after as a sort of maybe someone's, and at the time it was taken seriously.
Sure.
When it was written, but now we know better. But then you ask yourself, well, if that wasn't taken seriously now, but what was then? Why can't you do the same with the other texts and the other writers?
Sure.
They're weird. Yeah.
One of these things, and like you explained in myths, is that they're trying to understand their world. And clearly we don't have everything down, to a T.
Agreed.
Is there anything that they understood through nature, right? I mean, they definitely did have a better connection to nature than we did, or we do now, which is very absent for most people. Do you feel that they had some better understanding of reality to a certain extent? Is there stuff that they knew that we don't? Let's say. I mean, I know.
Yes.
Or forgotten. Sure.
That is a brilliant question. That is sort of one of the things that drives me to learn what I learned, because part of me feels that this, bad word to use right now, but the holy grail of mythology is to uncover this. As an analogy, to uncover this. Are there secrets they knew about the world that we've lost? Is there something? And what gets me is, so I'm more studying Indo-Europeans, and they have this view of the world being balanced such that if you took from the world, you have to give it back. So, and their view was that in the beginning, I talked about these two characters, Manu and Yimo, man and his twin. Well, in the beginning, Manu sacrifices Yimo to build the world. Okay, and then he uses different parts of Yimo's body to build different people on this world. So some people built from his head, some from his body, some from his legs. And so it is thought that you live, but when you die, your body then goes back into the earth, and your hair becomes grass, and your bones become rock, and your blood becomes water, and your flesh becomes soil, such that when someone is born again, they take from the earth, and their bones were made from rock, and their blood was made from water. And so, in effect, they had this cycle that you must balance what you give. Whatever you take, you put back. And that I quite like. It's quite poetic and romantic, but I just like the fact that they had that view in life. That if you have that as a real belief guiding your everyday practice, then does that make? I don't know if that makes life better. But to me, it feels like that's a better attitude towards life than maybe wanting to be number one on TikTok.
In general, yeah. In general, the balance thing. I mean, I don't know if this has any play, but I mean, it's not exactly, but there is some similarities, obviously, to the yin yang understanding. Yeah, right. Okay, so they were influenced by each other. Okay.
Yeah. So the Pangu is basically influenced. We believe there's some influence there. I think that's again Bruce Lincoln who wrote a bit of a paper on that.
Sure.
Yeah. So
okay.
It's religious linked.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that fascinates me as well, because I mean, we're so locked into our world here, into our worldviews here, which no one's saying we don't know a lot. I mean, we're the masters of matter and doing all this stuff, but one wonders where we're headed with our technological advancements and how we kind of, whatever. Like, I don't know.
Of life. We've lost. There is no point to life. If you want to be philosophical about it, you just enjoy yourself and then die.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you want to enjoy yourself?
Right. What's the best way? What should be the way? Do I have a path? Is there a better way for it? Those are the questions that I think are pretty much lost, and they're going to continue to get lost as long as you can't sit down and have a deep analytical look at your world, where you came from, why did all these people do all this? I mean, you have thousands of years of work from your species being done, that builds upon itself. And so you should probably look to see if they found anything interesting.
Yes, for us to be here, our families went through so much. I mean, war and famine and plague and all sorts, and yet we're here. We're that lucky to be here. Why are we not trying to give something back? Which is sort of why I do YouTube and possibly why you do your podcast. In a way, it's a way of not only learning and helping yourself grow, but other people to listen and grow too. And to me, that's why I do this. But
sure.
You hear stories of kids who just play computer games and want to do that for the rest of their life. And they could be enjoying themselves doing that. But you think,
sure.
When
what's
you
your contribution?
You want to be remembered. Exactly. And there's actually a poetic term in Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European which goes, "Fame does not decay," suggesting that that's the way of being immortal. Because they knew they couldn't actually be physically immortal, but they knew if they'd done deeds that were so great, people would write poems about them. That's what you want to do. You want to be so great that people would write songs about you. Nowadays, you have to be sort of an ex-boyfriend of a female singer, maybe, and then you get written about you.
Isn't that crazy? It is crazy because I mean, in it's funny. It sounds like I see this quote in football as well. I think Clarence Seedorf, if you know who he is, he put out do you know who Clarence Seedorf is?
No,
he's a footballer, excellent footballer from the Netherlands. Played for AC Milan, tremendously, won the Champions League with 3 teams, incredible.
Oh, wow.
And he said, nowadays it seems like people don't want to be good at the sport to get their notoriety. They just want to be known. And all the youth, there's a big push to just be known. And if you want to be a star, he's like, just like, get good, go deep, understand it really well, train and go that, And so it is funny to me, and I don't know if this is true. This is another question I can ask you. I know a lot of times the fall of the Roman Empire is linked to this shift away from good values. I mean, it's obviously it's a bunch of things, I'm sure. But there's this shift away from having good people in power, and then I think, correct me if I'm wrong. You may not know this since it's not necessarily your specialty, but I think they started to revere chefs and other things like that kind of mimic what we do in our reality TV shows. Not necessarily philosophers, not necessarily excellent politicians that were noble and things like that, but they started, pushing up people that might not be this. They became the ones to look after. And then a couple generations later, you had people wanting to let me just do this. Let me just be a TikTok star. And then before you know it, you have a couple generations that are,
that's what happens. So you see this cycle. This is a well-known psychological cycle that if you come from a sort of a poor background and you work hard, you become good, your child will probably see off that and they become good and rich and they give to their child. And what you find is that the fourth generation has so much, they go back to being poor again because they don't know how to work it. And you see that with empires and with kings and there's all sorts. It's a very well-known cycle. You see this. And that was part of the reason for Rome's change and collapse, because it basically turned into the Roman Catholic Church basically became the Roman Empire. And they had this awful, and you say lucky. I mean, it was a perfect storm for that to happen. There's almost like no change, but yeah, they just didn't have the resources. They became too big for what they were, and it wasn't managed by the right people as well.
Then it does beg the question, then why did Egypt last for so long? I mean, that is a massive empire for way longer than everybody else.
Absolutely. I mean, that's partly to do with how they were. They were lucky. And again, there's so many things. So weather-wise, geography-wise, they were lucky. So when they started, Sahara was going through a green phase, we call it. So the pyramids were built in grassland pretty much rather than...
So there was grass there before?
There was grass there. Well, certainly very close by. It wouldn't have been desert like it is today. The Nile would have been a bigger river. In fact, to me, it very much hints that water covered much of the land around the pyramids and was one of the mechanisms used to transport and to refine the stones for the pyramids. But it was green. But also they managed to merge their two kingdoms because there was a north and south kingdom. And they merged those, which helped. And it was just well run. And they were in a place where they only had to defend sort of a smaller border. They couldn't be attacked from the north. They couldn't be attacked really from the east, although they eventually would be. But that's when technology got better and people could sail and the like. So, they were just in a
nice spot.
Yeah, a very good place. Yeah, they did well. You will get environments like that. But again, it wasn't perfect. I mean, there was a lot of incest in Egyptian royalty to keep the power there, and that obviously then caused issues. As much as you like to think things were good there, all these pyramids were raided within the lifetime of the next pharaoh. They weren't there. People knew they were raided, which is why the tombs were then built where you didn't know they were. They were secret tombs. So you see that happening. But yeah, I think there would always be an Egypt in our civilization. I think by the way things were in terms of there would have been a sort of a culture that had that or something that stood out. I mean, because Greece was pretty, although it didn't last anywhere near as long, it had all that ability called the end of the Egyptian Empire, really, and went on. So, we see examples like that. We also see how empires change or cultures change, like Göbekli Tepe. Are you familiar with Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah, of course, in Turkey over there.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that only lasted for a period of time, but it looked so successful. But then they buried it. And you think, where did it go?
That sounds crazy to me. I've heard this so many times. I don't understand, because this place existed, 9,000 years ago or something like this?
About 11,000 years ago.
11,000 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, it stopped being used, yeah.
Sure. How and why? And we didn't know about this. Like, I grew up with history books telling me that, nope, we didn't do it. We were just still hunters and gatherers. And then boom, this discovery happens. And it's like, no, there's this massive place out here where they were doing well. And then they buried it. How do we know that they buried it? And what is the current best understanding for why?
We know they buried it because of the way the soil is packed into the remains of it. So you can just tell it was buried rather than it was destroyed, because nothing was destroyed. It was just filled with earth, and you could just tell, okay. And it didn't fill earth naturally. You could tell the earth was put there deliberately. So that's how we know it's buried. Why? Well, to me, I'm not an expert on Göbekli Tepe, but because there's a number of sites now around that region. But to me, this starts at the end of the Younger Dryas period, but finishes when agricultural farming is now a major thing. So people have started to learn how to farm. And it may be that it perhaps wasn't in the best place for farming, or perhaps there were other cities elsewhere that would seem to attract better riches or better quality
thriving,
of life.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. We see that. So, yeah, but who knows?
Okay.
People may have preferred to go down to the Near East, down to Tigris and Euphrates and down there. So, yeah, there's many options. I don't think we'll ever truly know, but I'd love to try and understand the iconography there, because that's sort of the missing link in terms of religious belief. You know, hunter-gatherers we think were animists, so they felt that things that moved had a soul, for want of a better word for it. You know, rivers move, so there must be something alive in the river to make it move. The wind blows, it must be alive. But then when we start to sort of personify gods or put imagery to gods, when we started to farm in certain places, but there's this sort of jump between the two, which we're not entirely sure what is going on there. It looks like there's some astrological effects in there, possibly constellations, but we're not entirely sure. I'm always a bit sceptical about some of those things without real understanding. A few stars on a picture does not mean that there's an exact representation of the solar system, for example. Where I see some would-be academics say, "Oh yeah, there are nine stars on this map. There must be a map of the solar system before we knew about it. So it must be advanced alien technology." And it's
Atlantis and
Atlantis
and Roswell.
Atlantis, Israel.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Last question, real quick. Let me throw out here, and I don't want to pick on Catholicism too much or Christianity too much, but I gotta know because I think you've done some work in this area. Christmas. We talk about it being a pagan religion. Is it a pagan religion? And you also talked about why December 25th. So maybe you could touch on that.
So definitely pagan religion because it's pretty much on winter solstice. So, and that was the most important day of the year for most pagans. So most people, where everybody talks about midsummer, everybody celebrates like longest day in summer. Actually, the longest night is the most important night because that's when you're closest to the dead, closest to your ancestors. And the day after that, the days would get longer and you knew winter was over. So that was the most important night. Why Christians or the church developed December 25th does look like it was based on the fact that they believed Christ was seeded at Easter, and 9 months after Easter is Christmas. And we see this because Christmas is also celebrated on the 6th of January in Orthodox religions and the 25th of December in that, because they have different dates for Easter. The calendar was slightly different.
Okay.
And so we believe it wasn't that they picked 25th of December to necessarily conflict with paganism, although there may have been if we do that, we can also influence paganism. Right. And we see that with things like Halloween and All Saints' Days and All Souls' Days. Again, it's a mix of things. There's never just one idea. I don't think the church is that clever to come up with one idea to do it. But
okay.
Definitely.
Fascinating. I mean, you're definitely gonna have to come back on. Maybe next time, some other time, we'll stick with one subject so we can go deeper in on it. But I have too many questions. I'm gonna have to make it like a 3-hour podcast sometime. Or you're over there. Maybe I'll come to you one of these times.
No, I'll come to you. I don't mind this.
Pretty
flexible.
Honestly, because I would love to have just those type of podcasts you can listen to and stories and just really just literally grab a cup of tea and just sit there forever.
Exactly. We literally have just scratched the surface of everything we talked about.
Totally. Okay. Well, where can people find more of this? Because I know they will if they're listening.
Okay, so I have a YouTube channel called 𝗪𝗪𝗡, 𝗪𝗪𝗡𝗪d, and I'm Jon F White. I don't really use other social platforms very much, so just look for me on YouTube, and hopefully it's one of those channels you didn't realise you wanted to watch until you start watching it.
Exactly. All right. So, guys, we will link to everything. Obviously, if you're listening to this, it's in the show notes.
Thank you.
And if it's on YouTube, link is in the description. Thanks a lot, man. This is awesome. I appreciate it.
It's always been a real pleasure. Thank you.